Hi, I'm Sylvie from HR.com, and I'll be your webcast host today. Welcome to Navigating the Growing Pay Equity Movement, what employers need to know about what to do. Sponsored by Trusaic, moderated by Gary Davis, and presented by Joanna Kim Brunetti and Mark Dwyer. This webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI business credit and one SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A tab of your webinar controls and type them in there. And it's my pleasure now to turn you over to today's presenters. Gary?
Thank you, Sylvie. I was on mute. Sorry. Hello, everybody, and welcome on behalf of Trusaic. My name is Gary Davis. For those of you who aren't familiar with Trusaic, we are a software and services company. We'd like to think that we simplify complex data and complicated regulations to give employers the information and confidence they need to bring their businesses to the next level. We're also very proud that we have a Net Promoter Score of world class. We strive to exceed our clients' expectations by always getting regulatory compliance, data quality management, and software done and done right. Today, we have two speakers. First is Joanna Kim Brunetti. Those of you who have been on some of the webinars we did when we were first Capital Consulting, now Trusaic, are familiar with Joanna. She's a former partner with Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. She also brings additional regulatory compliance experience from her pre-legal career in consulting and the aerospace industry. She holds a BSc degree in chemical engineering from University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. Our other speaker today is Mark Dwyer, PhD, Vice President of Data Science for Trusaic. Mark was formerly a senior consultant for the Harris Economics Group, where he provided written and oral expert testimony regarding the interpretation of empirical analyses. He directed data cleaning and the construction of empirical models, among other responsibilities. Mark has a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester, an MA in finance from the Wharton School, and a BA in physics from the University of Pennsylvania. So now I'm going to turn this presentation over to Joanna.
Thank you, Gary. So today we're going to be covering a number of topics. We're going to be talking about the current trends in the U.S. regarding pay equity laws. We're also going to take a look at what's going on outside the U.S. For signals for what may be future U.S. policy. And then finally, we're going to be talking about how pay equity audits will be a critical piece to your compliance puzzle and how it fits into your business operations. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the current trends in pay equity laws. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the big trends that we're seeing are these things called safe harbors. And for the pay equity audits, these safe harbors are essentially allowing employers who conduct pay equity audits, it allows them to limit damages that can be asserted against them by a plaintiff in, for example, in a pay discrimination lawsuit. So one incentive is to sort of put a cap on the type of damages that an employer can be assessed with if they conduct the pay equity audit. And importantly, these pay equity audits do not necessarily require that the employer fix the pay disparity, but rather that they demonstrate good faith in working towards achieving pay parity. And so the states that we've seen this in is Massachusetts, Oregon, and Colorado. And there are important differences, which I will get into on the next slide. Okay, so in Oregon, employers can avoid emotional distress and punitive damages if they've conducted a pay equity audit within the last 3 years and can demonstrate reasonable and substantial progress towards closing the wage gap generally. So, as I had mentioned before, when we're talking about these pay equity audits, what they're doing is you're basically looking at what your pay disparity is, and then you are making good faith effort, or in the particular case of Oregon, reasonable and substantial progress towards closing the pay gap. But importantly, you don't actually have to achieve it. It's about progress or working towards it. And what Oregon offers is, avoiding emotional distress and punitive damages. And I have to emphasize how important the punitive damages element is, because that's going to be where the real hammer is in terms of, liability. That can be a big problem for employers with pay gaps. Punitive damages can far exceed the actual damages. Now, for Massachusetts, it's a complete defense. In that if you've conducted this pay equity audit and there's a good faith standard, if you've conducted it within the previous 3 years and before the action is filed against them, conduct this audit, and there's reasonable self-evaluation of pay practices and demonstrate reasonable progress towards eliminating the unlawful pay gaps, then it's a complete defense. In Colorado, which is often thought of as safe harbor light, employers can avoid liquidated damages if they conduct a quote-unquote thorough and comprehensive pay audit within 2 years of the complaint. So there's important differences in these jurisdictions, and importantly, this is with respect to state law. So this doesn't provide a complete defense against other laws like federal laws. Next slide. Now, on the federal level, we've had the Equal Pay Act since 1963, which requires equal wages to be paid to men and women performing jobs that are A, require substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and B, are performed within the same establishment under similar working conditions. So that law has been around for a long time, but it is often thought of as without teeth. And so what's been happening is that there are states are passing legislation that expand the scope of this, the phrase, the word equal, to substantially similar. And what that does is it allows for more, more people to be compared. Like in the most sort of strict example, one jurisdiction may understand the Equal Pay Act to be basically same pay, same job, even though there could be two jobs that are pretty similar, just saying, well, they've got two different job titles. So that's the most extreme view of looking at what equal pay for equal jobs. So what the states have been doing are passing legislation that gives that more room instead of making it like the same. It's just now substantially similar. And the states that have been passing this legislation include California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Oregon. Next slide. Okay, another area where there has been, sort of allowing more gender pay discrimination lawsuits is restricting the affirmative defenses available to employers. Under the Equal Pay Act, again, this is a law that's come out, more than 50 years ago. It provided 4 different types of justifications for gender pay disparity. One is seniority, another one is merit, another one which is a system which measures earnings by quantity or quality of production, like, for example, like an assembly line, like how many pieces are processed. And then this 4th factor is differential factor based on anything other than sex or gender. And so it's this 4th justification that is really employers had had a lot of room to come up with justifications as to why there was a pay disparity in genders. And so what states have been doing is increasingly limiting what constitutes that 4th justification. And there are states where they are using the sort of bona fide definition, which the 4th justification isn't just any factor based on sex, but rather that it has to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. And these states include California, Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. Now, there is federal pending legislation that would also close that 4th justification loophole. Again, that 4th factor would be bona fide and consistent with the way the states are defining it. Next slide. Now, another area which really kind of dovetails into the sort of pay disparities, there's a trend towards salary history bands. And we'll get into this later, but one of the sort of root causes for pay disparities in gender is basically knowing what the person made at the prior job, and that just kind of, perpetuating in each subsequent job. So the salary history band prohibits employers from inquiring about a candidate's earnings history, basically what they got paid in the past, and using that as a basis for that person's pay at the new job. So it's, we've got 18 states and Puerto Rico that have already enacted a salary history bans, and that's been over really the last few years. So you've got states like California, Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, and New York, and even Alabama. And then there's a pile of cities that have salary history bans specific to this city and for the agencies within it. And so two examples come to mind, San Francisco and New Orleans. But, I note that some of these cities are very small cities too. So it's not just the big cities. Another aspect is wage transparency, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the UK laws. But wage transparency laws. But it prohibits retaliation against employees who discuss pay with others. So, employees can discuss how much each other are being paid. That's the idea, is that you can't prohibit retaliation against those employees who do so. And this is, again, like towards a trend towards just, transparency, where everybody knows what everybody else is getting paid. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about some outside U.S. jurisdictions. Another interesting aspect to pay equity that's related is California AB 168. It requires an employer, upon reasonable request by a job applicant, to provide the pay scale for a position for employment. So if a job applicant is looking to fill a position at your company, if they make a reasonable request of, what's the pay scale, what's the pay range for this job, the employer has to provide it. So all of these things are towards a trend towards transparency in terms of what people are getting paid, and also prohibiting the use of sort of, past pay discrimination, essentially. Next slide. Okay, so I want to take a look at a few of the countries in the EU and what may be sort of a harbinger of things to come in the U.S. Next slide. Okay, so the UK Equality Act of 2010 had these pay data reporting requirements, and that's really only recent. That started in 2017. And it required essentially all employers with 250 more employees to publish pay-related data. And what that would mean is it includes the median and mean gender pay gap, can we go back to the next slide? Sorry. Proportion of men and women receiving a bonus, and the proportion of men and women in each quartile pay band, which is basically in this pay band of X dollars, or I guess in that case pounds, for the year, for the quarter, how many men and how many women are how many men and women are in these pay bands. And so what this does, it's publicly available and searchable, and so it allows the public to see if there is a pay gap. And it's really just kind of raw data. There's no sort of justification discussion or anything. We talked about that earlier regarding that fourth factor, a factor based on gender, and then the other three, seniority, merit, et cetera. That's not accounted for. It's just raw data of how much men and women are getting paid for, and with regard to pay as well as bonus. And what this is, it's essentially been thought of as shaming. If you have a big discrepancy in terms of pay between men and women, it's not going to look good from a PR standpoint. And so this pay data reporting requirement in the UK is designed to basically, allow people to see, the public to see what companies are getting paid. Now, is this a trend? So the U.S. Under the EEOC had required this component 2 data reporting for employers over 100 employees. with very limited exception. This was due very recently. I think it was in September, just last month that it was due. And it was for reporting for the 2017 and 2018 years. It's unclear whether this reporting requirement is going to be resuming. There's some litigation over it, and it's not clear if it's going to come back, be reinstated, or just put on hold. But importantly, while it's not a public disclosure like the UK pay data reporting, well, the EEOC has data, raw data, with no explanation for what what justifications that might exist. But the EEOC has that data, and companies, again, over 100 employees, they've been reporting it, and it's not clear what the EEOC may do with that data. But they can certainly look into it, and if there's, pay gaps that they view as unreasonable or whatever, that could potentially trigger an inquiry or investigation, or worse, ultimately be exposed by a plaintiff in a pay discrimination lawsuit, for example, can actually get those records from the EEOC. So that's that raw exposure there. And then in 2018, New Jersey itself began requiring pay data reporting requirements for public contractors. So these are kind of akin to the UK pay data reporting, and we'll see whether or not this will continue with more jurisdictions on the state level, and with next year's election, depending on the results of that, whether that might trigger more pay data reporting requirements. Next slide. Now, we just talked about the UK. In France, they have a similar kind of pay data reporting, they call equal pay indexes. So it's already gone into effect for employers more than 1,000 employees, and back in March, and it's gone into effect with employers between 250 and 1,000 as of September. By next March, organizations with 50 or more, that's a lot of organizations, they have to assess their compensation structure that basically uses a method that equates points with progress towards reducing the pay gap. And it's these points that are public-facing for the public to see whether or not companies are getting closer to reducing the pay gap. And companies that don't do so are subject to penalties. Okay, next slide. Now Spain, again, this is very recent. Employers with 50 or more, as of, this was passed in March of 2019, employers must develop and publicly release workplace equality plans. A requirement of the plans is for the companies to conduct a pay equity audit, and they must prepare reports to their employees showing average pay levels broken down by genders and other factors. Next slide. So we've just been talking about sort of all very recent regulations that are really gearing towards reducing the pay gap. And so the whole point of all of that is you got to do a pay equity audit to know what the metrics are to figure out how to reduce it. And next slide. So let's, the first question is, well, what exactly is a pay equity audit? Well, the definition is an analysis of your workforce that identifies the pay disparities, which could lead to liabilities, which we alluded to earlier, and then the weight of various factors that contribute to the pay gap. And this is something that can be privileged, basically from mandatory disclosure. And so you're doing this pay equity audit to figure out, well, what exactly is the gap? And as part of the pay gap and pay equity audit, you can look at factors that are going to apply in your particular jurisdiction, to sort of to justify some of the gap. And then at some point you may and very likely have some unexplained pay gap that's not justified by one of the four factors that we had talked about earlier, the merit-based, seniority, based on the number of quantity, quality of parts, and then that fourth factor, which has been narrowed. So what a pay equity can do in terms of your operation, is it quantifies your risk. So it identifies the risk and then where the risk resides, and it's going to help you defend against claims against discrimination. And it'll allow you to monitor what factor differences drive the wage gaps over time. It also identifies roots of the pay disparity. It quantifies the unexplained ones, the ones that you can't explain by, seniority or what have you. And, we're talking like virtually all about gender, but this would also apply to age or race and ethnicity or other protected classes. And having the pay equity audit done is it gives you the numbers that you need to figure out how bad is the problem. And you're going to need to know that in order to figure out what remediation, if any, you're going to do. Once you've got the metrics, which are, there's a regression analysis done. Once you have the metrics, then you move forward with what you're going to do. So it provides insights to management to make change in their organizations as needed. It's, doing a pay equity audit obviously will also help bolster the employer being an equal pay employer. And from a PR standpoint, it increases recruiting, retention, and engagement. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here are some just sort of basic steps to a pay equity audit. You want to establish confidentiality, privacy, and if applicable, privilege protocols, and identify who the team members are. You want to establish the scope of the analysis, basically, what business units are going to be analyzed, what establishments, basically which employees are you going to look at, and over what time frame. And are you going to look at total compensation? Are you going to look at also bonus, et cetera? And then you're going to look at what protected class you're going to be looking for. Well, we've been focusing on gender, but it's certainly not limited to that. You can do it for age, race and ethnicity, disability, whatever. Now, you also want to identify what the applicable legitimate business factors are. And we've talked before about these sort of 4 factors. So as they apply to your organization, you want to identify them because that's going to help you explain what some of the pay gap and reduce the unexplained pay gap. And then you're going to identify what we call pay analysis groups, which is to sort of identify how the groups are going to be organized. They could be organized, for example, using the EEO1 classifications, which are like executives, managers, professionals, clerical. There's one, I think, craft workers. You could organize it that way, or you could organize it in a way that really sort of is more fact-specific to your organization. And then once you've figured out which groups are going to be sort of compared, that's your pay analysis groups, you then are going to get all the data for them. And that's a big issue that is sort of the elephant in the room that nobody seems to talk about, is the problem with getting the data right. And, most statisticians will tell you that is, you need the data in order to run the analytics and sort of garbage in, garbage out. That data needs to be clean and complete. And so getting that data set ready is a very critical step. On there, there'll be vendors who can do that. We are a company that does that kind of data cleansing, which is critical, as well as the pay equity audits. Then once you have the data ready, then you're going to do the statistical modeling. And this is not a one-size-fits-all. There are going to be different regression or non-regression analyses that would apply to a particular, your facts. And so you need to know, you need to have someone who understands that can do that modeling, and that's applicable to your set of facts. Once you've done that modeling, then you're going to look at the outliers. Basically running the stats, you figure out which employees are the outliers. And so the regression is handling the sort of the bulk of the employees being analyzed, and then you get these outliers or stragglers, and that just need to be looked at, where you roll up your sleeves and really critically review these outliers. The good news is those should be pretty small. So once you've done this analytics, then you can figure out what kind of remediation strategy you're going to apply and implement to your organization. And the remediation strategy can be from the quantitative metrics of pay adjustments, which don't necessarily mean lump sum. It could be over time, and that will depend on sort of the budget and sort of what makes sense for your company. And there are also going to be other remediation strategies that's not so quantitative, but really sort of qualitative, that go into the root causes that require maybe policy changes, et cetera. And then lastly, and importantly, is you want to monitor and track it, because once you've done a pay equity audit, it's static. It's just what's going on as of right now or as of the time frame that you've identified. But more employees are getting hired, more employees are leaving, people are getting promotions, et cetera. So it's not a static thing. It's something that's going to be changing. And so you're going to want to monitor with some periodic basis to make sure that the analysis you've done and the remediation steps you've taken are actually moving towards reducing the pay gap. Next slide. Okay. Sylvia, could you launch the poll question? Okay. So the question is, now that you've heard this explanation of what a pay equity audit is, has your organization conducted a pay equity audit in the past 2 years? So it's yes, no, we have done some analysis, but not a pay equity audit, and don't know.
I'll give it another 5 seconds or so to get your votes in. And sharing the results.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the polls, what we have is we've got the majority of, or the plurality, we have no at 39%. The next one is at 28%. We've done some analysis, but not a pay equity audit. And 18% said yes. So, 85%, I'm sorry, my numbers are not the best here. So 15% say don't know, but importantly, less than half has done no, as they've done some type of pay equity, less than half, which means that more than half have done no pay equity analysis, or they don't even know that they did. And so that's going to be an issue, because pay equity is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and really kind of the forefront of the news and legislation. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mark, and he's going to discuss the findings of a survey we sponsored with the Harvard Business Review Analytics Service to provide insights for your operations by looking at the drivers and barriers to conduct pay equity audits, where the pay disparities are most apparent, and the causes of pay disparity. Mark?
Thanks, Joanna. So as Joanna just mentioned, we're going to dig into this survey, and it's interesting to contrast with the results of the polling that we just did a moment ago. Can we have the next slide, please? Great. So this is giving you some background on the respondent pool that was used for the survey. The survey responses are concentrated in the U.S., with about 12% coming from outside the U.S., namely from the U.K. 80% of the respondents are from firms with at least 1,000 employees, and half of the respondents characterize their organizations as being global or multinational. The responses are roughly balanced between genders, between male and female. 2/3 of the respondents are executives or senior management, and most respondents are not in HR. They're coming from other departments. The sample is roughly balanced across 5 industries, with a 6th industry, namely healthcare and pharmaceuticals, represented about twice as often as these other 5 industries. Next slide. Okay, so this is contrasting the results, the overall results about whether organizations have conducted pay equity audits, and as you can see, these numbers are very different from the survey, the polling that we just did in-house. In the UK, a greater share of respondents indicate that they were conducting pay equity audits. Conversely, in the U.S., those who have no plans to conduct pay equity audits are much more represented than they are in the U.K. Both are small, between 1 and 10%, but in the U.S. that number is much higher than it is in the U.K. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. And so this is just a brief combines the two sources, the UK and the US, into one chart. And you can see that among these typically large, often global companies, 77% overall claim to be already conducting pay equity audits. All right. Now from these sort of big overall perspective, we'll turn now to what drives the motivation for pay equity audits. If we could have the next slide, please. Here we go. So the most popular external drivers, the survey respondents indicated that hiring and retention is the dominant motive for conducting pay audits. While this likely reflects the importance that employees do place on pay fairness, it also raises the question as to whether some respondents are confusing pay equity audits with benchmarking to pay surveys as a means of offering competitive compensation, because that's also going to be relevant to competitive hiring and retention. Reporting requirements such as those required by federal contractors and also disclosures as is in the UK edge out litigation risk for the #2 driver of pay equity audits at 31%. Also, social media in the form of recruiting websites seems to offer comparable motivation to these survey respondents as to that coming from litigation risk at 25 and 26% respectively. Next slide, please. Okay, so different motivators. Again, so now this is going to be contrasting results from the US and the UK. In the UK, where reporting regulations make pay gaps more transparent, companies have to publish them on their own websites, pay audits are motivated less by the competition for talent than as explanations for those reported pay gaps. And that's what we see by that 54% in terms of responding to pay reporting requirements. Pay reporting requirements in the UK do not require companies to conduct pay audits, but they're conducting those audits in response to their disclosure requirements on their overall pay gaps. In contrast, that labor market motivation is stronger, much stronger in the US. Even though UK firms have to publish their pay gaps on their websites, those published pay gaps do not seem to raise their perception of litigation risk, at least as a driver of pay equity audits. Instead, litigation risk is a weaker motivation for pay audits in the UK than it is in the US. And we see that it's basically half of what it is in the US, between 28 and 14%.
All right, and Mark, if I may,
yes.
Mark, if I may interject, so if the U.S. had pay reporting requirements like the U.K., which may be happening down the pike, we might see an inverse of these results. You know, like
yes,
it would look more like the U.K.
Yes, pay transparency regulations seem to be very important for conducting pay equity audits, as a motivation for conducting pay equity audits. In the UK, at least, simple pay, and that's what I was about to say, is that in the UK, at least, simple pay transparency regulation seems to substitute for litigation risk as a driver of pay equity audits. Okay, and I think we have a poll question. If we could launch the next poll question, please. What has or would motivate your organization to undertake a pay equity audit? Please choose one answer. We'll wait for those results here.
Okay, I'll give it another 10 seconds or so.
Alrighty. There we go. Okay, so here, managing risk of litigation, which is consistent with the stronger response that we got in our survey among U.S. companies, that managing risk of litigation is the top driver. and that is followed a close second by pay reporting requirements, which could be interpreted as the situation that federal contractors find themselves in, because they need to be on top of this sort of pay equity situation in order to maintain their federal contracts through the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. Labor market competition is still a driver here, and that again there is some concern about proposed legislation, because the legislative landscape, as Joanna described, is evolving so rapidly and becoming more stringent at all these different levels of government. All right, great. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so we've talked about what drives pay equity audits. What prevents companies from conducting pay equity audits? Next slide. Okay, so the first set of barriers to conducting pay equity audits are simply the absence of the main drivers that we identified above. So regulation, competition for talent, and lack of other pressures to conduct pay equity audits. The second set of barriers focuses on not having available resources and data to perform pay equity audits. Pardon me. So the cost of diverting resources and the lack of recorded data. Finally, concerns about how the pay equity audit may be used can result in postponed pay audits. And this so that's this issue about privilege and how confidential and protected would be the results of the pay equity audit. And that brings us to our next polling question, which if we could launch that next question, please. How much is attorney-client privilege valued when overseeing pay equity audits by your firm? Is it highly valued, somewhat valued, not valued, or we have not done a pay equity audit? Give that a few more seconds here.
And another 5 seconds or so.
All right, and the results are in. Of those who have conducted a pay equity audit, which is we have about a third who have not. This is suggesting that it is highly valued, that privilege is an important consideration and important to maintain. Another component of that, though, about half or a little bit less of those respondents say that it is not valued or somewhat valued. So, but the dominant view is that privilege is important because it gives you flexibility, essentially, in terms of how transparent and what kind of strategies you want to take in terms of responding to potential pay disparities that you see. All right. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So this is drawing on some of those barriers that we talked about a moment ago, which are resources and data. As we saw a moment ago, resource considerations are barriers to conducting pay equity audits. In addition to drawing on statistical and legal expertise, accurate pay audits typically require a significant investment in producing quality data. Particularly important is ensuring that the factors that determine compensation are correctly and completely represented in the data. And so the next survey question will provide a couple of reasons why. Sorry, not the next. It's not a polling question, but the next questions in the Harvard Business Review survey provide a couple of reasons why data wrangling costs are often more substantial than firms realize. So we've got first, and just to finish up here, we've got that first expertise piece, which is the data expertise, the statistical modeling expertise, and the legislative and regulatory expertise. Now we're going to be focusing particularly on that data wrangling, data expertise. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is asked in the Harvard Business Review survey, where is your data for pay equity audits? Where does it reside? Less than 1 in 5 respondents indicated that the data on employee and job characteristics were in the same data warehouse. This illustrates and emphasizes how data preparation costs can be underestimated when firms make decisions regarding pay equity audits, because there isn't a formal evaluation, a careful evaluation that these data may be in different silos and have to be brought together. Next slide, please. Okay. Then in addition to this, fewer than half of the respondents, if we focus on these last, the bottom bars here, the job characteristics and employee characteristics, which are data that are critical to valuing, to understanding pay compensation, pay differences. Fewer than half of these respondents indicated that their data on job and employee characteristics are complete. These data are typically necessary for an audit. Without these, it is difficult to have much confidence in pay equity results. Okay, now this leads to our next polling question here on this webinar. So if we could launch that next question, please. How confident are you in the accuracy of your organization's employee data? You're very confident in its accuracy? Are you somewhat concerned about the accuracy? Do you lack confidence in that accuracy, or do you not know? I'll give that a few seconds here.
And get a few more votes in, and we'll close it in about 5 seconds.
Okay, so we have a little less than half saying that they have somewhat are confident in the accuracy of their data. A little bit under a third saying that they feel very confident that their data is on target for conducting a pay equity audit. And then we have the remainder, we have a good 22% or so, 23%, indicating that there's strong concerns in terms of the integrity of that data. So again, that's something where someone's conducted a pay equity audit. You probably know how much effort and investment there was in pulling that data together. If you've yet to do so, you may want to consider that you may be underestimating the task at hand there. Okay, could we have okay, so the next slide, yes. Okay, so this is moving beyond the survey for a moment, but drawing on its results to talk about 4 misconceptions that again are barriers to conducting pay equity audits. The first, waiting to be forced by regulation to conduct pay equity audits is a bad strategy for several reasons. And to name just 2, first, a firm may already be behind recent legislation and not know it. As Joanna surveyed, diverse legislative pressures at the federal, state, and local levels have created an overlapping mosaic of shifting regulations and litigation risks. A business presence in multiple jurisdictions requires significant work just to know in what areas an organization may or may not be vulnerable. Second, all firms are operating in increasingly diverse environments in terms of talent, potential customers, and sources of investment. Examining pay equity improves the firm's ability to successfully engage with these diverse operating environments. This is reflected in many sources in the research literature, including a recent study by the World Economic Forum, which found that the business case for explicitly embracing diversity is overwhelming. Okay. Then I touched upon this issue about external benchmarking versus pay equity audits. Market rates can perpetuate pay disparities, for example, through pay differences in comparable positions that reside in historically gender-separated departments, or through the historical valuation of male-dominated traits that do not ultimately improve productivity. Pay equity audits so that's important to recognize, that you may be competitive you may feel you're competitive, your organization's competitive in terms of its hiring and retention in terms of compensation, but there still could be pay problems there because there are disparities in the marketplace. Okay, then in terms of data availability, we've already discussed this to some extent. Pay equity audits can be incorrectly deferred based on the misperception that if needed, it can be analyzed easily. An audit can be done easily. In practice, assembling data on relevant employee characteristics, job requirements, responsibilities can be the most time-consuming portion of the audit. If factors aren't accurate, measures of disparities will not be accurate either. Okay, and then I wanted to touch too on another misconception, which is the notion that there are few similarly situated employees. Giving employees or individualized job titles doesn't make them incomparable in terms of a pay equity audit. It just renders job titles useless for the purpose of conducting the pay audit, particularly under the similarly situated standards that Joanna highlighted earlier. Ultimately, individualized or highly individualized job titles raise data costs as job attributes, requirements, working conditions, and employee performance measures become even more critical to the analysis because job titles are just potentially unusable. So it's something to keep in mind that you may feel like you've got a whole bunch of atomized job titles out there that are largely not comparable, but they just won't enter the analysis, and they wouldn't enter the analysis in a regulatory review either. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now this is getting more at where are our survey respondents perceiving pay disparities to exist, and what is driving, what is the underlying mechanism for those disparities? Next slide. Okay, so regarding the sources of pay differences, survey respondents indicate that 57% of them indicate that salary history, that prior salary history received the most, was the dominant factor. I'm sorry, I'm getting a slide ahead of myself. Where disparities are most apparent is in gender, and then age and race ethnicity come in basically tied behind that. So we see that the emphasis is on gender, but there is some concern in race, ethnicity, and age. And what's interesting here is that age actually has a slightly higher response than race and ethnicity. So there is a lot of concern about potential concern about age discrimination. That's something important to test for. Okay, let's see here. Then the last point there on that slide is not directly about where disparities are observed, but or perceived, but rather where disclosure and discussion is prohibited. And we see here that over a fifth of respondents consider themselves to be prohibited by their employers from comparing compensation with coworkers. Joanna talked about recent legislation that is moving to make this allowable as a matter so that employees can discuss and have more transparency in compensation. But this result in the Harvard Business Review survey may mean that we have just depressed response rates in the survey regarding perceived pay differences. In other words, the perception of gender, race, and age disparities that we're getting in terms of responses may be low because a fifth of the respondents felt like they were in the dark, that they're not even allowed to talk about pay differences. Okay, next slide. Right, so now moving from where pay disparities are perceived to what are the perceived sources of those disparities. Next slide. Okay, so at the top of the list is prior salary. Regarding sources of pay differences, 57% at 57% salary history received the most responses and can reflect the perception that employees are on relatively unchangeable trajectories from their first day with the firm. At 42%, many respondents also identified discrimination in advancement or effectively glass ceilings as an underlying cause of pay differences. At 35%, pay rate discrimination is just saying we're getting paid different rates based in a discriminatory fashion, just very clear. It's really the least ambiguous response in terms of identifying explicit discrimination. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is one of the important elements to conducting a pay equity audit, in that it does move the needle in terms of those perceptions. After pay equity audits, more weight is being put on prior wages, okay, which may not be a good thing, but it is in and of itself, but it's saying that it's not a explicit pay discrimination, okay? So if prior salary is something that is a legitimate business factor in your jurisdiction, which may be a shrinking pie, that may mean that there's no disparity. Alternatively, this, as we'll talk about a little bit in a little while, if you can ground the source of a disparity in a factor that was formally used for compensation decisions, that gives you another way of communicating it and for rolling out remediation. So that's not all bad news. Okay, 42% of the, let me see if I'm on the, right, so 42%, at 42%, many respondents also identified discrimination. Sorry, I'm in the wrong slide. Just a second here. There. Okay. So after differences in prior, there's also, in terms of conducting pay equity audits, how does that move the needle? There's a substantial reduction from 48 to 29% in the perception that pay rates themselves are discriminatory. Again, that's sort of like the strongest, we're just getting paid differently, and it's just because of a gender difference or a race ethnicity difference. That interpretation, that perception falls dramatically when a pay equity audit is conducted. And that's a pretty strong positive, I think, to come out of audits. Pay equity audits also tend to weaken somewhat the perception of a glass ceiling. It's down from 48% to 40%. That is that there is discrimination in advancement opportunities. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is leading change, and who is leading change? Next slide. Okay. These results indicate that human resources and senior management are the constituencies that need to be on board with pay equity auditing. Those are the ones that are really driving it for the companies that we surveyed. Okay, next slide. Great. So now there are two slides here. This is a preliminary slide. How do you accurately measure the pay gap? And there are two parts to this. First, this slide highlights 4 elements that are necessary foundations, the necessary foundations for an accurate pay equity analysis. So the first is knowing the difference between a gap and a disparity. The pay gap is the overall average pay difference between protected classes, such as men and women, before controlling for business factors that determine pay. The portion of the gap that is not explained by business factors is the pay disparity. Pay disparity can reflect a pay discrimination liability. Okay, the business factors, and it's important, I put here that these factors might be considered tainted. I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. That business factors explain any portion of the overall pay gap between protected classes means that these factors are not balanced across protected classes. The larger the gap that is explained by business factors and the fewer the factors that explain that gap, the more likely they reflect non-wage discrimination and may be considered to be factors that are tainted by discrimination. Okay. Then moving on to the next point, we've hit this a few times, investment in data is critical to accurate results. The cleaner and more comprehensive the data on factors are, the more likely those factors are to reduce or eliminate pay disparities. Okay. Then a couple of things that Joanna mentioned, pay analysis groups. They have to be of sufficient size, both to make accurate measurements and to be meaningfully distinct from each other. And then I've also touched on this idea of tainted factors, and the degree to which they are aligned with protected classes is really where they can fall from the analysis, because they're just too strongly aligned with protected classes. Okay, so that's the foundation. If we move on to the next slide. Right, so with that foundation in place, accuracy of a pay gap analysis depends on the balance between robustness and precision. And at the bottom here, just highlighting those last 2 bullet points, that robustness is a driver of making analyses larger, that they have to have more moving parts to them to a pay equity audit, whereas precision works in the opposite direction. And that's why a balance has to be struck using various statistical measures between those 2 forces, and that is where accuracy lies, in the midpoint between a balance of robustness and precision. Another important point, though, is that regression, as we've already alluded to, is the primary tool, a useful tool for measuring how much of the gap is explained by business factors and how much is left over as pay disparities, and as well for validating that factors actually explain significant wage variation. Reliable regression analyses must reflect 3 components: the specifics of the firm's compensation philosophy, a careful understanding of what the available data represent, and the relevant jurisdictional differences in which the firm operates. Okay, so that's just sort of an overview of what you should be looking for in terms of an accurate pay equity audit. We can move on to the next slide. Once that audit's conducted, what options does an organization have in responding to identified pay disparities? And I've laid out a bunch of stuff here, and we're running out of time. But there are three interrelated points that I'd like to hit on. One is the organizational culture and how that affects transparency. The second is the nature of the disparity and whether it makes sense to go back and invest more in the data step. That's one of the elements of that. And then the other is the budget and the time frame. That interacts with transparency as to whether you do something all at once or do something in an incremental sense. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Can you maintain existing compensation and incentive frameworks while resolving pay disparities? Our first assumption here is whether the existing compensation system is discriminatory. For example, does it tend to perpetuate inequities reflected in the labor market, or is it grounded in justified business factors? If the compensation is based on valuing justified factors, eliminating pay disparities will serve to strengthen the alignment between the compensation system and actual pay rates. Okay, and then one more slide. We'll go to the summary here. Okay, in summary, pay equity audits identify pay disparities, which are potential liabilities, and the weights on business factors that contribute to the overall pay gap. Well, many say that they already are conducting a PEA analysis in our HBR survey. Misconceptions may make this number overstated, particularly as to whether there's confusion with respect to external benchmarking. Increasing and varied federal, state, and local regulations make it more difficult to know whether an organization is affected. Safe harbor opportunities appear to be increasing, which is a good thing, and another further motivation to conduct those audits. Regulation, fear of litigation, and competition for talent were the greatest drivers in our survey, from the HBR survey. Fragmented and incomplete data cannot be underestimated, and one has to take a serious look at that. And the perceptions of pay equity disparities seem to be dominant in gender, but there's also concern for race and ethnicity. Okay, that's it, and I think we are running short on time, but that brings us to our questions, I believe, in our next slide.
Yes, Mark, that's correct. And we do have a couple of questions that we'll answer. And I do want to note that any questions we don't answer, and even the ones we do, will be responded to in writing, and we'll share them with the people who asked the questions and also those who are on the webinar. So the first question we have here is a question about how laws are affecting different types of companies. So is pay equity regulation, litigation typically being enforced more for publicly traded enterprises, or are there examples of private companies being penalized?
To answer that question, I'm assuming we're talking about the U.S. and we're talking about pay equity laws. Obviously, there's variations in the states, among the states, and some states have, the laws are stricter than in other states, and and even by jurisdiction in terms of municipalities. So some of the cities have certain rules as well. There's no, none of these laws are specifically, create a separate rule for publicly traded entities versus private companies. And they're both, to the extent their jurisdiction has the applicable pay equity laws, they're being enforced, at least in theory, equitably. Now, or they're both getting tagged. I think what's happening is, with regard to publicly traded companies, they tend to just show up more in the news, so it seems like they are being targeted, but they're not particularly, and they certainly wouldn't say that they are. And a lot of these rules that we've been talking about are still fairly new, and so they haven't kind of, been marinated over time for plaintiffs to get excited and sue on that basis. But we're going to see that coming. It's 11 right now. So with that, any other questions that have not been answered, we will answer them in full in writing.
Sylvie, do we have time for one more, or are we out of time?
We are
we're out of time.
We're at the top of the hour.
Great. Okay, well, again, as Joanna mentioned, we will respond to all questions in writing, and you'll be hearing from us with those answers soon. Sylvie?
All right, I'd really like to thank our sponsor, Trusaic, and our wonderful presenters for this important information they shared with us today. Also, thank you to the audience for joining. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the recording will be available from our archives. We'll be sending you an email with your credit information. You'll also find the credits in your View My Credits page of your membership profile once the webcast has been archived. Did you know that our free members now have unlimited access to watch all of our live and archived webcasts and virtual events? Free members can collect up to 5 HRCI and SHRM credits each month. If you watch more than 5 webcasts in a month, your credits will be banked. To unlock and redeem your extra credits, upgrade to our recertification program. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page. I also put a link in the chat for you. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.